Marching Through Georgia, the first book in S.M. Stirling's Draka trilogy, published in 1988 and sparking arguments ever since. I'm going to use it to briefly talk about the relationship between social structures and technology. As usual, I'm kind of assuming that everybody that's watching this is familiar with the book, but if not, here's a very quick rundown. It's a World War II story set in the Caucasus, following a unit of Draka paratroopers dropped between German forces and Russian partisans. The Draka are the bastard children of colonialism, an anti-America of sorts that, instead of trending toward liberty and progressivism, doubles down on slavery and conquest. Sort of like a bunch of Rhodesian Mongols that see themselves as the lords of mankind. Over the years, several people have commented that the weapons used by the Draka in Marching Through Georgia are overpowered and anachronistic. The most frequently cited examples of this are the Holbar's T6 assault rifle and the Hond 3 tank, which I've seen erroneously compared to the M1 Abrams on far too many occasions. For the sake of discussion, let's assume that the events described in the book are an accurate account of real events. And to keep this relatively brief, let's keep our technological focus on one piece of equipment. In this case, the Holbar's T6, which in usage is an assault rifle, but mechanically is a belt-fed machine gun that's just been shrunk down for the Draka 5mm by 45 cartridge. This depiction is based on specs given in the book and what we can discern from the cover art, minus the bipod and 4x scope listed as standard equipment. The T6 is kind of an odd beast, being belt-fed from a 75-round drum. No one would do it that way now. But in 1936, it would be the obvious way to go. There are numerous types of belt-fed machine guns long before the 1930s. The T6 just shrinks it down for an intermediate cartridge to make it usable as a rifle on full auto. But this isn't forgotten weapons, and the question that we're concerned with is why would the Draka be so far ahead of the curve in seeing the need to equip their entire citizen military with select fire intermediate cartridge rifles, when most of the other major powers in the world were still using bolt-action rifles chambered in full-power cartridges. To answer that, let's briefly look at the history of machine guns. We'll start with the Maxim, and I know that Gatlings were around decades prior, but the Maxim was a true machine gun and it saw widespread use, and in a few places continues to today. But it took a long time. The Maxim became available in the 1880s, but until the Great War, there was very little interest amongst the major military powers. Armies tend to be conservative, European armies especially at this time. A proper European war shall have no need of these chattery contraptions, thank you kindly. But the Maxim was used extensively by British colonial forces in Africa. It may be ungentlemanly to rely on a machine rather than skill and valor, but when thousands of Matabele warriors are charging at you, you take any advantage you can get. For the British public, these bush wars were something that happened far away, something that they could either ignore as the natural way of things, or become very indignant about and demand that somebody do something that wouldn't require any sacrifice on their part. But the Draka live there, surrounded and outnumbered by an oppressed population of serfs that they are dependent on. There is a constant pressure to increase lethality, for reasons more pressing than fighting a hypothetical war in Europe. Because the entire Draka population lives in this environment, there are few social factors pushing them to moderate their weapons or tactics. There's no insulated, ultra-conservative military aristocracy with chivalric ideas about what war is, and there's no wealthy liberal elite insulated from the problems that outrage them. Everyone is living with the same constant threat of massive slave revolts. They're not trying to deter other nations. They're trying to keep their maids and cooks from butchering them. These are people that are going to start manufacturing automatic rifles as soon as they figure out a reliable way to do it. There's also a fundamental difference in how the Draka approached the war. Even the aggressors in our Second World War framed it in terms of defense or ethnic unification or something of these sorts. Not so the Draka. Well, in general, the world situation is approaching what we in strategic planning call an endgame, analogous to the Hellenistic period during the Roman-Carthaginian Wars. The game is played out between the great powers and ends when only one is left. The old Draka explains the balance of power at the time and why it's in America's interest to defeat the Germans. The USA and the domination would divide the spoils between them, the Draka said jovially. You'd have a generation of peace at least. It would take us that long to digest our gains, build up our own numbers, break the conquered peoples to the yoke. Then, who knows? We have superior numbers, patience, continuity of purpose. You have more flexibility and ingenuity. It'll be interesting, at least. One of the great tragedies of this story is that the Draka are very upfront about what their intentions are. They repeatedly tell us that they plan to eventually take over the entire world, and nobody believes them. It doesn't matter that their entire history is a steady progress of attack, subjugate, consolidate, repeat. The rest of the world refuses to see past their preconceptions. The Draka don't lie to themselves about why they have armies. When they want to attack someone, take their resources, and enslave them, they're completely upfront about it. And because they're not lying to themselves, they're also very honest with their assessment of military technologies. They know that they need overwhelming superiority. At this point in history, the Draka are still fairly backwater in the eyes of the major European powers. The British are still thinking of them as sort of an errant dominion, and the Germans are not really planning on getting into a war with some pack of yahoos in Africa. All the European powers are preparing for wars with each other within the Clausewitzian context of politics by other means. The Draka are diligently preparing to seize any opportunity to expand their territory at the expense of their competing powers in the context of a long-term plan for world domination, and they have the resources of the entire African continent to build their military with. And this leads to a post-war technological explosion that mirrors our own Cold War advancements. But we always knew that there was an accommodation to be reached with the Soviet Union. The Cold War with the Draka is fundamentally different, because not only can they not institute any meaningful reforms in their slave-based society, they can't even afford to coexist with any other socio-economic system. In the end, we'll have to conquer the earth. The Archon was right, you see. To survive, we've got to make sure nobody else does except as serfs. The struggle isn't merely ideological or economic, it's existential for the Draka. The only choice the Draka have is conquest or extinction, and that is what drives them. It's the basis for every collective action that they take. This determines not only their legal and economic structures, but greatly impacts their approach to technology. They're always trying to get an edge, which pushes them to develop and deploy new technologies as soon as they can make them work. But that results in final designs that are strangely anachronistic to our eyes, like steam-powered trucks and miniaturized belt-fed machine guns. Technology is dependent on resources and knowledge, but it's driven by culture and ideology. Our example of the T6 rifle on its own tells us a lot about the society that built it. It's militaristic and technologically forward thinking, but confined by a brute force sort of innovation that sinks its teeth into the first solid option that they can work out and runs ahead with it. So they end up being the first on the scene with new technologies, but are quickly left behind as everybody else does the rest of the development steps. And so they are caught in this cycle of constantly having to introduce bleeding edge tech in order to stay ahead. We can apply this thinking to our own technology, which overwhelmingly is designed to be replaced rather than repaired. Ours is a system that churns out a steady stream of slightly improved gadgets year after year, while at the same time neglecting macro-level basic infrastructure. Which leads to a closing thought. The Draka are monsters, but there is one thing that we can learn from them. They take a long view, and they have a keen sense of consequences, and they're honest with themselves. That's how they win.